Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be here, and thank you for coming, and thanks very much for the IPHS as well as the local organization and Christine for inviting me. So, many leading scholars, journalists, and politicians call this the Asian century. How does planning negotiate with these changes in Asian cities? What is the role of planning history? Most of what is written on Asian cities sounds like the changes are driven by urban development ideas, practices, and experiences of the West. One of the most influential planners in Asia, Lu Tai-ke, reported to this Congress in 1998 that planning in Asian cities is conservative, reactive, piecemeal, and lags behind the environmental changes. Grounded planning interventions into Asia's transformations require a deeper understanding of the ongoing spatial processes. Deeper understanding is precisely where the contribution of planning history and grounded theorizations are sorely needed. The main impediment for inside-out planning approaches in Asia is the Western cultural hegemony, or approaching urbanism and planning from Eurocentric lenses. The hegemony of superficial knowledge so produced has not only curtailed the development of grounded theories and practices, but its power has marginalized emerging knowledge and practices. The superficiality has enabled the power holders to assert their own preferences, these politicians and big capital, and their rationality over others in regard to development and planning. Good. There is a large volume of literature on Asian urban transformations, but the knowledge it presents is highly abstract and rarely grounded. According to mainstream literature on globalization, modernity, global cities, international development, neoliberalism, and their principal critics, Asian cities are following global models, adapting well within West-dominated urban hierarchies and spatial structures. These narratives are about the West, especially how Western capitalism restructures itself as it moves through Asia, occasionally allowing some Asian actors to play larger roles within it. Beyond the high-end urban areas, other knowledge on Asian cities considers the low-end and traditional, which are opposites of the developed West. While Asia has large empirical presence in scholarly work, there is hardly a theoretical presence. Asia is a database for Western understandings, and this knowledge is insufficient to engage in urban transformations in a way that matters to ordinary people and everyday circumstances in Asia. My aim is to demonstrate the need to go beyond this limited epistemological space and acknowledge, enable, and critique locally produced or creatively adapted planning practices and ideas. It is directly related to the aim of the conference, that is to advance the comprehension of planning history in distinct space-time conditions in terms of social, economic, political, and cultural dynamics. I will first discuss how planning was established in Ceylon, the colonial territory which became independent in 1948 and renamed Sri Lanka in 1972. This is to be specific and sort of like have evidence, as Steve said earlier. I will then identify a few innovative planning practices and highlight the significance of developing a grounded knowledge of planning history and practice in Asia. In the non-West, where industrial cities of the Western kind did not exist, planning is an import. Anthony King has well demonstrated that colonialism was the prime vehicle of transfer. As developed within the colonial third culture, the contents of planning laws and procedures were debated and contextualized by the colonial community. Curiously, planning was imported to Colombo in response to urban problems similar to those that inaugurated planning in Britain. Since the early 16th century, Colombo had been the capital of the Portuguese, Dutch, and British colony of Ceylon for 4 centuries. It was built and restructured according to contemporary European urban physical norms and was augmented to the changing needs of the colonial community. Adapting to this environment, the colonial community also evolved with the port city. In the late 1910s, quite abruptly, the British municipal authorities in Colombo reported the city was infested by urban problems such as bad housing and overcrowding. I investigated 6 possible causes. Well, the municipality, the establishment of the municipality. However, it was established in 1865, many decades before. Second, the expansion of the British colonial involvement in the city. Well, the municipality already included large areas that were not planned by the British, and also in after the between 1860s and 1880s, the city was expanded to incorporate a lot of other areas. Third, there was the data. Census data collection became a regular activity in South Asia from 1971. Fourth, the availability of analytical methods. Well, they existed. The scientific exploration of social problems, particularly their quantification, also took root during the late 19th century. Fifth, the sudden increase in population. The density of Colombo less than doubled between 1871 and 1921. And finally, concentration of migrants. Well, actually the suburbs were pretty much growing at the time when these issues came about. So for me, which I have published this, I can share this with you, the necessary condition was the enactment of the Housing Ordinance of 1915, which followed the British Town Planning Act of 1909. Whatever the conditions that Colombo may have presented, the knowledge developed in the metropole and adapted in the colony made the municipal authorities see particular conditions as problems. The problems of overcrowding, bad housing, disease, and the absence of sanitation. Here the authorities transformed ground conditions or data to fit the framework, interpreting these as the same problems to which the original British Act responded. The information acquired by the authorities did not represent empirically known truths, but it constituted contested knowledge of a socially constructed reality. This new vision caused a sharp turn in the formal urban perception. The focus of the municipality shifted from infrastructure development and engineering to correct the living environments of the urban poor. It was just not a problem, but it became, the municipality considered that to be the responsibility of the municipality to intervene into these poor people's lives, and especially the environments. By emphasizing the moral and intellectual superiority of Western culture, Europeans were able to justify the violent project of imperialist expansion as a civilizing mission whereby the British believed they were rescuing the poor. Within a year, the Kochikade area near the port was declared insanitary. However, decolonization did not stop this colonial mission. It was continued into the post-colonial era. The export of town planning ordinances was not limited to Ceylon. I'm taking Ceylon because I want to kind of like make a informed case. But was wide-ranging. The processes that included Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, Rangoon, Singapore, Lagos, among others. The problems imported through the housing ordinance could not be solved. These are new problems by the municipality or the colonial authorities. They belong to a different imagination of the city, developed within the town planning discourse in Britain and the empire. Hence, the municipality consulted the planner. It was this need in colonial cities that provided the context for the rise of colonial planners such as Patrick Geddes, Clifford Holliday, and Patrick Abercrombie, and the internationalization of the planning profession across the empire. The colonial community and the Ceylonese elite also debated the issue through the major newspapers. The Daily News stood for town planning. Ceylon observers stressed social aspects of housing and affordability. The municipality continued to impose standards and embrace town planning. I'm just going to be brief about these things, and we can talk more if you need to. The leftover issue of poverty and lack of housing were later taken up by the socialists. The government invited Geddes, and he arrived in 1920. While calling for conservative surgery in poor areas, he identified the colonial areas as beautiful and stressed making the city even more beautiful, and drew up a comprehensive plan. He helped the municipality develop a new conception of the city which privileged capitalist processes and upper classes. Although Geddes' plan was shelved because it was for an area larger than the municipality got afraid. In 1940, Holliday also recommended procedures, rules, and methods within the same discourse, which were later incorporated into the Town Planning Ordinance of 1946. One by one, the colonial planners wrote the planning history of the future Ceylon within a town planning discourse initiated in Britain. The establishment of the Department of Town Planning in 1947 institutionalized planning. What town planning produced in Colombo was an abstract, outside-in, Orientalist perception of the city. The cultural hegemony of this urban and planning narrative was more powerful and long-lasting than building cities, far greater than any social, political, or military power the British could assert. As the planners and bureaucrats became socialized within the discourse, they reproduced the dependency on the metropole beyond Ceylon's formal independence. This perception did not go unchallenged, but was questioned outside of the planning realm. The Socialist Party in 1935 took on the issue of poverty. They protested against slum clearance programs, stood for the rights of migrants, self-builders, and renters, and fought for rent control. With the nationalists gaining power in 1956, the political leaders of Ceylon began to show caution over colonial perceptions, and much larger changes occurred in the 1970s. Yet these moves did not question any cultural values or assumptions held by the post-colonial perceptions of the city. And still, planners looked to the West to improve their perceptions and approaches to the city. Colonized or not, European expansion did not spare any nation in Asia. People's day-to-day language has not entered into planning discourse, the explicit objective of which is to service the public good. In Sri Lanka, people define space in terms of Handi, and Malu. In India, they use chokes. In Kathmandu, space is organized around Durbas and Hittis, and in China, longtangs are very important. There is no value for these spaces in planning, nor for the spaces I myself used during when I was growing up in Sri Lanka on a daily basis. They belong to a past, one the society has not been able to go beyond because it has not modernized. Maybe it's still a third world. The West European hegemony was never complete, however. The Asianizing of Asian cities is largely carried out besides, beneath, and around the processes of globalization, westernization by regular people and at the day-to-day level. Navigating the unknown and learning by doing, reflective planning practitioners in Asia are developing grounded planning approaches. Such inside-out practices found in the cracks and margins of the society are camouflaged by the Eurocentric ideological screens and have not gained much acceptance within the post-colonial planning, and education institutions. Hence, in order to see this, the planners and scholars ought to look in the right places, employ relevant intellectual frameworks, and adopt locally empathic vantage points. I mean, these are all argued in that book also. Although not as pronounced in architecture, innovative and subversive practices are not uncommon in planning. If I may relate to kind of like the earlier versions, Otto Königsberger developed the notion of action planning in India and also practiced it. Matthew Nowitzki, who developed the first plan for Chandigarh, finished all his designs in an Indian idiom. Institutions like the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore and the Mahavali Architectural and Planning Unit of Sri Lanka have developed their own models of planning. Kamala Raheja Vidyanidhi in Mumbai has been focusing on large-scale community development projects such as the Eastern Waterfront Development and the redevelopment of Dharavi, which some consider the largest slum in Asia. Faculty at the National University of Singapore, for example, is developing knowledge about Asian urbanism. Select faculty in universities in Asia, including at Moratuwa in Sri Lanka and School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, are attempting to redefine planning education. For Sri Lankan leaders, globalization has been both getting more connected to the world economy and also reasserting Sri Lanka's national identity. The UDA opened up the CBD, which is on the left-hand side, for CBD of Colombo for private capital in the late 1970s, inviting international banks and financial agencies to invest in it. Separating global economic and national political functions, the government built a new capital in Sri Jawadanapura on the right-hand side. While the new CBD in the fort was built by a private company in an international style, the parliament was built in a Sri Lankan style, representing and symbolizing the nation. In this, Sri Lanka produces its own globality, the other Asian nations as well, but in relation to a larger global context. There are fundamental differences in the way in which the Asian cities take part in the discourses of environmentalism and globalization. An extraordinary feature of the Colombo Metropolitan Regional Plan of 2001 is the acknowledgement of the existing system of rice fields, wetlands, and canal systems in Colombo, and undertaking to protect and promote that pattern. What is identified here is a complex vernacular land use system made up of natural landforms, natural and man-made water features, urban land uses, and farming, which cannot be characterized through Western analysis, I mean the separation of functions and parts. Here, planning begins by identifying the areas that should not be transformed and by promoting high-density development in other areas. In the Mahavali project, a large irrigation-based development project in Sri Lanka, the largest development project in Sri Lanka actually, its planning unit developed its unrelated version of action planning. Prior to that, after decades of construction, Mahavali towns in north-central Sri Lanka had very few buildings dispersed in jungles. This was due to a conflict between the British-type master planning that they used to plan and the local funding patterns. That was the practice. The planning unit established in the 1980s opted to provide towns for the settlers from the beginning. They should have towns from when they move in. These would begin as dense urban cores created by clustering institutional and commercial buildings built within a few years. As they expand outwards, the plans were updated annually based on the building program, funding which was allocated annually, and people's responses. The unit allowed flexibility for the users to adapt through loose-fit plan and building design. The towns were thus urban centers from day one, but their planning process continued in cycles. In this, the planners were in close touch with the agencies and processes involved in that project. Also in the 1980s, the National Housing Development Authority of Sri Lanka adopted a housing policy founded on the idea of support systems. This was based on John Turner's idea that the state provision of public housing is not a solution to self-building, since the latter is people's own solution to the lack of affordable housing. Instead, the people should decide what they want and the state should support. Although this sounds idealist, the Housing Authority did implement a policy based on support systems. While the policy is known by its political name, the Million Houses Program, its more substantive lessons are not a part of the planner's toolkit. In a bold move in the 2000s, the National Physical Planning Department, the NPPD, in Sri Lanka recognized planning is political. The planning commissions and boards at national and regional levels included leading politicians. This way, the leaders would bind to the plan that they got involved in making or authorizing, and have some interest vested in its implementation. Valuable experience such as Mahavali planning, support systems, and the NPPD planning are lost due to the exclusive focus on formal and Western processes. Such innovations can be found right across Asia, for which I don't have much time to do. The escalator project in Hong Kong and the Citra Niaga market in Samarinda, Indonesia are some examples. Conservation also provides an effective way to perceive the city or parts of it within indigenous histories, not simply as static environments. This could enable planners to develop a present that connects to a future of the city built on its past. I'm referring to like Jue Hutong project in Beijing, or the restoration of the Japanese temple and the development of the 406 Plaza in Taipei. These are good examples. There is a surge of planning in Asian cities, which is in search of ways to address new issues, new ways to address. Hence, the institution structures are also in flux. Most cities not only have plans, but also have new agencies, such as the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Agency Authority, the Delhi Development Authority, the UD and MPPD of Sri Lanka, or the Mumbai Regional Authority considers Mumbai region to be a multi-centric city. This is a different type of a city compared to the traditional ones. The debate around the redevelopment of Dharavi has provided great insights into Asian planning. Despite the attempts by the state and the developers to transform it, Dharavi thrives because of its illegibility to these agents. Jokin represents people who is caught up in the, but he is caught up in the oppositional discourse. It's transforming though. Utpal Sharma explores a technically viable solution, and Krishna Menon wishes to reassert the larger mission of planning, which is about people and public good. Sheila Patel adds the right to land, which is a right to citizenship, to the debate. And Anirudh Paul promotes conservative surgery. From a storytelling mode, Kalpana Sharma sees the significance of stopping, looking, and listening to the inhabitants. Prakash Apte is bold about the significance of the Dharavi's example produced by the people and calls for its replication with improvements. So it's a very rich debate. While Asia has been highly innovative, such innovations have been sporadic, temporary, and maybe out of place based on the formal frameworks. Most of them soon become absorbed into the mainstream or marginalized. It is the academics who are in a position to provide visibility to these innovative and grounded practices, to make the invisible visible. Planning critics have also made significant contributions, but they too are struggling within the larger system geared towards neoliberalism. In Slumming India, Geeta Devan Varma argues that the slum formation in India cannot be viewed as the making of slum dwellers or the colonial regime. Especially 6 decades after independence, and planning authorities have to accept the responsibility. Apte has rescued the story of planning Gandhinagar, which is marginalized in the context of Chandigarh. The mere documentation of these practices even as best practices, is insufficient. It is no point in turning these practices into data that can be understood within imported theories. They beg for interpretations, those found on grounded ways of understanding. They need to be documented in substantive and sophisticated ways that highlight their relevance to the locale. It should be made in such a way that it is relevant for a planner in Vientiane to read about planning experience in Kuala Lumpur, instead of always relying on Western and Westernized examples. This does not mean all practice in Asia are progressive, and Wu, in regard to Beijing, has kind of like warned us has highlighted that it's better to reduce the speed and scale of urban renewal and so on. People are also very important. People in Asia are far ahead of planners as a whole. There is much to be learned from people about Asian urbanization. However, the usual town meetings, which operates within the dominant discourse and dominated by the middle classes, are grossly inadequate. At times of transformation, it is important to maintain a much closer relationship with the society and pay special attention to its spatial changes. Engaging with the people and learning from them requires the crossing of the boundary between us and them. The planner should become a trans-status subject who can both operate within the domain of the subjects with whom she plans, and an outsider who brings value to the community. In closing, West European cultural hegemony goes beyond simple building of cities. They taught the subjects how to perceive the cities the way they did. The planner's city, instituted through importing problems and planning legislation, has caused a huge rupture in time and space in almost every non-Western country. Yet this is not total. Familiarization, including indigenization, localization, and personalization of spaces, are simultaneously forms of questioning, resistance, and adaptation of extant spaces and structures. The West European cultural hegemony is one layer in the multi-layered history of the present of Asian societies. Bridging the gap between the externally imposed West European categories and lived spaces of the ordinary people is an essential component of post-colonial scholarship. This is an area where planning historians and the theorists can make a major contribution. Understanding of Asian cities and planning on their own terms requires new analytical tools, which does not transform Asian facts into data within external frameworks. The documentation of grounded urban and planning practices in Asian cities with the subject's own understandings could provide an alternative toolbox of ideas that could be used along with other toolboxes to observe, understand and create diverse environments, and to inspire innovations of their own. In order to substantially engage the city, scholars and practitioners should understand the local production of space and develop an empathy towards the local inhabitants. This requires a shifting of the focus to local practices and the vantage point of inquiry from the outside to the locale. That is, to observe the production of space from the spaces of production. Thank you.